So I'm Margaret. A little bit about me. I've been working on Android development for about 4 years. I'm an Android developer at General UI. Right now I work on GoToTags app. And I'm also an instructor for the Android Application Development Program, certificate program at University of Washington. So I teach part-time. In my spare time, I also spend a lot of time helping out GDG Seattle and Android meetups. So today's topic is SQLite and Content Provider, and why I chose this topic. This is quite a painful topic. Whenever I talk to my fellow Android developers, whenever I bring up the subject of SQLite or Content Provider, everyone will either say, oh, that is boring, oh, that is painful, boilerplate code. And also my students, out of all the homework that I assign to them, the feedback is that the SQLite and Content Provider is probably one of the toughest subjects. So this is why I chose to speak about this subject, so hopefully I can help you out. I will talk about how to create a database, how to inspect the database with some of the tools, and how to access the database. Then the bulk of my time will spend on talking about SQLite, and then I will spend some time talking about how to write your own content provider and how to access the content provider. You don't necessarily need to write your own, but chances are you probably need to access a content provider as an Android developer. Then at the end, I will talk about some open source libraries, hopefully to help you to make working with SQLite Database and Content Provider less tedious and painful and less boilerplate code. So the diagram on the right is just the main things that I will be focusing on: the SQLite DB, Content Provider, and then ContentResolver, CursorLoader for showing the data to the UI. So now let's look at how to create a SQLite database. Before you start working on the code, the very first step, very important, is to define your schema, database schema. Because the database file will only get created once, unless you try to handle the upgrade. So you need to define your tables, the relationship between the tables and the columns carefully. So even if you change one little thing, like your table name or column name, you have to handle a DB upgrade, which is quite involved if you have input data from user. So once you plan your database schema, this is a high-level summary. You define a schema class, then you extend the SQLite Open Helper class to override onCreate to create a database. Then you override the onUpgrade to handle the new database version. And then after that, your database will get created, and then we'll talk about how it gets created. So I provide a couple of sample code. Actually, before I go on, I'm going to just pause really quick. For this URL, if you go to GitHub, just search on Margaret MZ, and for this repository, AnDevCon, you will find there are a couple of sample codes that I put there. One is for database, another one is content provider, and then another one is to use a library called the SQLite Asset Helper. So jumping back to planning here, the sample code that I provided are very simple. You know, when you store data on for Android, you can store in the file, you can store in shared preferences. Why you need database or using a SQLite is when you need to have complex data and queries, join tables, etc. But for simplicity of demo purpose, my sample code has just very simple database with just one table called the version that keeps track of Android versions with just a few columns. Now that I planned my schema, start coding, the first thing to do is to define a schema class. So this is a static class to maintain your database schema. Oftentimes it's named somecontract.java. If you put all the tables in one class, and I will show you a little bit later on in the SDK, you can actually see all the contacts and browser, etc. So you put all the tables in this one class, and then for inside of there's these static classes. Each class corresponds to a table. In this case, I have a version. Version means an Android version. My table name is called a version, right here, and I have these columns: code name, version name, API level, release date, and features of Android. And then notice here there's a projection of string array. This basically defines the columns you want in your query results once you query the database. So I'm going to jump back to actually, before I jump back, I just want to make sure this is actually being recorded. I think it's being recorded. Okay, so if you go to your Finder or your Windows Explorer, you go to a folder. Let's go to over here. This is the SDK, right? I find sources and the Android 23. Over here, if you search for something like contract, you see all of these classes showing up. They're all the contract classes in the Android SDK. If you click on, for example, the contacts contract, so you'll see this is actually the contacts. The framework provides like a contacts provider, and that provider underneath has a database. Then you will see all of the tables defined here. They're much more complex, but it all boils down to what I was telling you here, going back to here, that has a table name, define the columns and projection, okay? So we define that. Oh, one more thing, you can choose to put all of them into one table, or some people I've seen is they have, one table for each class, or you can have, you can put all of your tables in one class, called somecontract.java, or you can create one class per table. So some people prefer that. So second step is to extend the SQLite Open Helper. It's a helper class that gives you access to your SQLite database object and handles the transaction and upgrade and downgrades. Some tips on this: for the SQLite Open Helper class, when you extend it, you can choose to have it deal with just the creation of the database and also upgrade, then put all your logic of querying of select, delete, insert, etc. in a separate class, or you can put them all together, which is less usable. So inside of this class, how the database gets created, you will see that over here, you have this private public static string called the version table create. So basically that string construct a SQL statement for creating the table. For creating the table. So how many of you actually are familiar with databases and statements, SQL? Okay, most of you, right? So you understand this is how that's the statement. And then in the onCreate method, that db.execute SQL, you give that parameter of that string of creating the database, and that takes care of creating the database. I want to point out is that SQLite only supports some data types, and also for these data types, like for example, the the storage class of integer is similar to long in Java, and the real is similar to like double in Java, etc. You can look it up in the documentation, but when you create something like, like here, version, row, ID, primary key, integer, etc., SQLite is not going to check those types. You have to write your own code to check those. Now, we first define that schema class, and then we extended the database open helper. Now it's time to actually create the database. There are two ways of creating a database. One is to use the SQLite database object directly to create that in memory. I can see, I've never used it before, but I can see that one usage use that is probably in testing. You can do that. But typically, for creating an application, we use the second way, which is you extend the SQLite Open Helper and rely on that SQLite Open Helper to help you create the database. And when is the database getting created? The database file only gets created once when that get readable and get readable database is called. So some of the watchouts with SQLite, if you've worked with SQLite before, you probably have encountered this, like you made some changes to your schema and you run your app and nothing is reflected, right? So this is the reason why is because, like I said, the database file only gets created once. So either you go handle your upgrade with the new database version, or you have to manually delete the database by clearing out the data from your app, or you uninstall your app. Then run your app again. Then you will see your schema being reflected, new schema. And then also on upgrade, be careful when you drop tables. If you have multiple like tables relating to each other, like ABC, 3 different tables, if you do drop table A, drop table B, drop table C, and then you recreate A, B, C, you will run into trouble. So it's better to say drop table A and then recreate your table A, and then drop table B and then recreate your table B, etc. So that's just the creation. Do you guys have any question at this moment? No? Clear? Okay. So let's look at how to inspect the database. Before I look at the tools of inspecting the database, I'm just quickly go over some basic SQL statements. This is for the benefits of those of you who have no background knowing anything about database at all. So the basic statements, you can select, update, delete, or insert data into a table. And then you can also create table and alter the elements, create a new element. And so you can do select from the table name where some sort of condition, and you can order by, etc. So in here, if you go to this link, you will see what actually SQLite, actually the SQL statements are actually understood by SQLite. So talking about some of the tools, here's a list of tools. I'm not going to read out of the slides, but I will share with you a couple of tools I actually used. So I'm going to share with you a SQLite 3 command line tool later. I also share with you the SQLite Browser, which is a GUI tool. Another tool that's kind of powerful is the Facebook Stetho. How many of you heard of it or used the Stetho? Okay, one person. So you can check it out. Stetho is not for just database inspection. It also inspects network as well as the view hierarchy. So if you need to do all those, it makes sense. Otherwise, you may not want to go through trouble to use Stetho. So SQLite database, we'll talk about inspecting the database file. Where is the database located? On your device? Does anybody know? Yes?
You use application sandbox.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So internal storage, and it's associated with your app, with your package name. Okay. So later on, we'll take a look. If you're in Android Studio, you launch the Android device monitor and go to the File Explorer, you can find the database file under the data / your package name and the databases folder. So we'll take a look at it later. And then if you use the File Explorer, you can click on Pull to pull the database file to a local location. Here are some of the commands for SQLite 3, and again, we will look at it together. If you have access to my sample code, you can get those sample code. Any of those 3 sample code you run will result in a database, and then we can look at it together. So this one, SQLite 3, is a command line tool. It comes with your SDK, Android SDK. If you go type in ADB shell and then navigate to that your package name databases, when you type SQLite 3 and the database name, that will invoke the SQLite 3 tool on the database. You're actually inside your database where you can do some simple SQL statements to inspect your database, and then some commands for you to look at the list of tables as well as a schema of the table name. And then typing .exit will allow you to exit out of the SQLite 3 tool. There's a link at the bottom of it where you can actually look at more of the command lines. I find this pretty useful because when you work on an Android application, sometimes when you try debug, when you have a database problem, it's actually better to inspect your database in addition to just debugging. Okay, so another thing is the SQLite Browser. I gave you the link for downloading the SQLite Browser. Later on, we'll take a look how we use it. Once you download it, you can get the file, DB file, from your emulator. I think I forgot to mention earlier, if you want to inspect the database, it has to be on the rooted device or an emulator. Okay, so you get that DB file from your emulator. You can either use ADB command pull or you can use that File Explorer through the Android device monitor. And then you can open the browser, SQLite Browser application, and then you can modify the database, and then you can copy it back to the emulator to see the effect. So let's take a look how it works. So this is a sample app, SQLite for creating SQLite database. Really quick, this is the class I was talking about that contains your table name, columns, as well as the projection, which is your query result. And then the DB helper, which we extend the SQLite Open Helper class. And in here, you see a bunch of code, but all it does is that these will refer to whatever is being defined in the other class. And then this one is your SQL statement for creating the table. And then in onUpgrade, call this method, DB execute SQL with that string. And then you create a database. And then onUpgrade here, because it's a sample app, we just drop the table and recreate it. If for your production app, if it's read-only, it's okay, right? If it's read-only, but if you're actually getting the user input, you don't want to just drop the table, okay? And then the main activity, you can look through this in details later. Basically, in here, I define a object called Android version, and then I put that inside of this DB helper, try to get the versions out, and then I use it in the UI here, okay? So now let's take a look at this one. I already ran this before. You just see a couple of the Android versions there. This is quite simple. It's not the UI, but it's the database we want to look at. So if we come here, okay. so let's look at this one. I was already in here, so I'm going to exit out of there. On this one, this is the SQLite 3. We can, actually I was already in there, so let's just open a new one or use a different one. So we will try a new one, ADB devices. So you can follow along. This part I will go kind of slow, that you can follow along. So if you have my sample app, you can run it to an emulator. And once you've done that, you make sure it's attached. Once you do that, you will do ADB shell. And here you will see there's data. And you will see over here we have these some sample apps there, right? So I can take one of these. These are my sample apps. And you'll see there's a databases folder. And Android-release DB is the one. So even though I was looking at a different app, but all three of my apps have the same, use the same database name. So you'll see in the code here, this is where I define my database name, which is right here, right? So coming back here, I'm on the database now. Well, I'm on the folder where the database is. What you will do is you will do a SQLite 3 Android release.db, and then you're inside of the SQLite 3, so you can follow along. And now here you can type in .tables, and you will see version, which is a table that I defined, right? And then you can say .schema table, version. And this will give you that schema, which is, this actually corresponds to this, right? So you will see that here it's actually easier to see. Now you can log that string as well. But this is a good way for you to inspect a database. You can also do other simple statements like select all from version. You'll see all the Android versions here. Select all from version where the ID is 8. And then, just the jelly beans being selected. And then I will do quit, which will quit me out of the SQLite 3, and then exit, and then you will be out of the shell. Okay, so that's the command line, SQLite 3 command line tool. Let's take a very quick look at the SQLite Browser. So this is the one where you can just open the database. And how to get the database, you can do an ADB pull, but I will show you exactly where it is. So launching the Android device monitor, and then we're going to go to the File Explorer and then actually see exactly where the file is. We saw that earlier from the command line, right? And I just want to show you from a GUI perspective since I'm showing you a GUI tool. So over here, if you click on File Explorer and make sure you're on this one, if you have multiple ones, data, and then going down and find your package name. These are my sample codes. So I'll just grab this one and then expand databases. Over here, you can just pull it, pull a file from the device and save it to a local location. I already done that before, so I'm not going to do that here. Now coming back, if you're in this SQLite Browser, all you have to do is just open database and open that Android-release.db file. And once you open that database, I open this one. This is what you will see. You'll be landed on this structure here, where you will see the metadata, sequence, and version. So version is actually your table name. So I will click on Browse Data and Version, and then you will see the table is displayed here. So I can click on new record and then just type marshmallow, etc. So I'm not going to go through all of that because of the sake of time. But once you add a record or delete a record, you can just save. In this case, it's called the write changes, but it's Control S or Command S will save the file. You find that file, and then you can push it back to your application to see the effect. So I think I showed you the tools. Any questions at that point for using the SQLite 3 and the GUI tool for inspecting your database? Have you used these tools before? No? SQLite 3? Okay, you can give it a try. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talk about access a database. So we created a database. We took a look at the database schema and table, etc. with the tools. Let's talk about how to access your database. So this SQLite database object gives you these methods: insert, query, update, and delete for the operations on your database. And now this is where people complain a lot. There's lots of these code, like for example, the simple query will result in all of these, right? You have to get your helper, your database open helper, and when the get readable or get writable database is called, you get that SQLite database object, and then you use the query method. And when you use the query method, you need to give it a table name and then the projection. So projection is the result column. So what you want to have from your query back. And then the rest of it is how you set those some of the parameters, such as what kind of records you want to select. Basically kind of like filtering down the results you want back, right? You want a result back. You only want the record back when the ID is such and such, when the name is such and such, right? Okay, so I also talked about cursor. So what is a cursor? The cursor points to a current row in the result set. And it's really confusing that it starts before the first entry in the set. So you need to call move to first or move to next. So I never remember these, but this is the code you can find to how to get that cursor and iterate through to get the records. And the SQLite Query Builder is just a method for you to convenience to join tables together. So to access the database, you saw that to create a database wasn't too hard. You define the schema, you use a database open helper, call some methods, and your database gets created. Not that difficult. But the complexity of accessing, working with the SQLite database is not just getting the database created or execute some queries on your database. The complexity is that you have to make sure your database querying, the operations needed to be done asynchronously in the background. It cannot be done in the main thread, right? And another thing is I talked about cursor. You use a cursor to access the database. Then you have to remember to close that database and close that cursor, and it's very tedious. And then another complexity is when your data changed, say a user input a record, you have a list showing in the UI. After that, you need to handle the requerying of the data change and refresh your UI after the requerying. So this is the challenge of working with SQLite. It's not so much of creating the database and querying. It's these things I listed here. So how do you solve the problem or when you face the challenge, one option is to write all of that yourself. Get the cursor, close the DB, close the cursor, write your own threading, handle the recurring, refresh the UI. Okay, that's a lot of work, right? Alternatively, you can use a library, which I will discuss at the end of the talk. Some of the libraries can help you without doing all of that work. But for today's talk, since I'm talking about Content Provider, I will give you the option of writing the Content Provider and then access your data with the CursorLoader, which the CursorLoader will handle the requerying of the data, maintaining that connection, handling, observing the data change you're requerying, as well as refreshing your UI. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to talking about Content Provider. Any questions at the moment after I zip through all the database topics?
In the Android device monitor, where did you show to look at the tables again?
Okay, I will show you that. So you know how to find the monitor, right? It's that little guy. And then once it's launched, it's one of these tabs, File Explorer. And then if you don't see it, I believe Open Perspective or one of these will allow you to find it. But typically it's already there. And then once you go to File Explorer, it's under Data, and then your package name. And then under your package name, there's always a databases folder that gets automatically created. And then the database name is defined by yourself in your code. You can put that in the DB helper or your table class.
And then only you got the view, right? The database view. The next you showed the database view. How do you get that one?
The database view. Oh, this SQLite Browser.
Download that one?
You will download it. Let's go back to the tools. It's the second one that I talked about on my SQLite tools. You click on it here, and then you can download these. One of these, for your computer, because mine is Mac, right? And then once you download that, it's just an app called the SQLite Browser. And then you launch that browser. You can, because over here you can pull the file, right? Or you can use ADB pull. Either way, you get that DB file out. Yeah, and then over here you will just do open, like Command O, and open. You will see this one, which is you define. The name is defined by you, and then you open it up. Okay, so you're not directly accessing that database of your app. You're actually pulling that database file out and then access it. So it's for inspecting database purpose. It's not so much, oh, your app is running in the middle of it, you can go use a tool to access it and update it. No, it's not like that. Okay, but later on we'll talk about one of the libraries to help you if you have an existing app. Like I had my existing app where I had lots of data. I already put it into the database I saved, and then I can ship it with my app. So I will show you. When I did mine, I actually just wrote the code myself there, but there's a library called the SQL Asset Helper to help you with that. Okay, good question. Any other questions before I move on to Content Provider? So I'm going to move on to talking about writing your own content provider. If I go back, I should have put the graph here. If you look at this graph, this is what the architecture looks like, where you have the SQLite database that contains your data, and then the content provider is like a layer on top of it, and then there's the rest, the ContentResolver and CursorLoader, right? So that's where we are, is to talk about the content provider now. So what is a content provider? I showed you that it's kind of this interface to your database. and it provides managed and secured access to your data. You create a content provider for your own app that you can access, or you can have other apps accessing your data. Okay. So it's useful for cross-processing interface and data sharing. And I just said you share data. And then in the Android manifest, there are 4 components. Like you define your activity, right? And you register your service, you register your provider. Content provider is the 4th component inside of your Android manifest application. So why or when do we need a content provider? Because not everybody need to write your own content provider. You write your own content provider when you want to share your data with some other apps, or if you want to use features in the Android framework such as a CursorLoader. It is possible to use the CursorLoader. Actually, no. It is possible to write your own loader directly to work with SQLite. But to use that CursorLoader provided by the framework, you have to use a content provider. And some other Android framework features such as search auto-suggest. Like you have a search box when you start typing, the auto-suggest feeds up. That you need a content provider. And copy-paste or sync adapter. So today's talk, I'm focusing on SQLite DB, content provider. What I'm not talking about, the challenge is data syncing, right? When you have data, and how do you sync with your server on what frequency, or how do you resolve conflict, etc. So sync adapter is a mechanism provided by the Android framework, conveniently help you to do all those data syncing. If you do choose to use a sync adapter, although it's not mandatory, but it's recommended that you will have a content provider. So here is a high-level gist of it, how to write your own content provider. Again, there's lots of terminologies and lots of things that seem to be very confusing, but I kind of summarized everything here so that you have a high-level overview of if you ever write your own content provider, you go look at a sample code, at least you know these are the steps you need to do, right? So the first step is you're going to create a class that extends from content provider. And later on, you're going to register that in your manifest. So the name must match with each other. And then you will create content authority, path, content URL, content type, etc., etc. So we'll talk about that later. You create all of those in your either your DB schema class that I mentioned earlier, or you put in the content provider. Like I said, you add to the provider class if there's only one table, but if there's multiple tables, you either add it to that DB contract class, or some people, they choose to write one class per table, then you put it in there. Whatever your class that contains your table, you put all of the information there. Then you use a URI matcher to match your URI pattern to integers. Then you implement the required methods. And those methods are basically kind of repeating or replicating those, let's query the database, do a insert, do a querying, or delete or update, right? And then finally, you register your content provider in the manifest. So it's simple, right? Extend the class from content provider, a bunch of things in there, then register in the manifest. So let's look at all those head-spinning terminologies. I think it is a bit head-spinning because there's like so many to remember. Okay, so the content authority is the symbolic name of the provider. It's kind of like, if you have an Android app, you know how the package name defines like a unique identifier for your app, right? For a content provider, that content authority is the name for the provider. A lot of times we will use the package name and then append that whatever provider name there as the authority. And then the path is a name that points to a table or a file. Okay, so earlier on I talked about table and table names, so the path corresponds to that. And then the URI will identify that piece of data in the provider. So the URI can be very generic of everything from that table, or you can be more specific with that content ID to say, I want that individual row where the ID equals to 8, right? And then content type, which is what actually stored in your provider. So the content type, these are just examples. You don't have to remember all the details here. You know, when you look at sample code, you can probably copy paste some of the stuff. But here's just an example. Even if you're not working with content provider or anything, I'm sure you've worked with, you know, text type is a plain or HTML type, right, etc. And then the last couple types, this is actually what you would define in a content provider with that, you know, the beginning and then the rest that you will actually define. What is important about a content type, I think, typically is when you actually want to be able to say, when someone is working with this MIME type, my app will actually resolve that type. So it's important when for that scenario. But if you just want the content provider to, you know, you query the data, you don't even need to define that get type or for this part or deal with the content type part. And then the URI matcher is just a convenient class, and then match the incoming URI to the integer values. So you can match it to like a wildcard or match it to a specific record. And finally, for the content provider, these are the methods. Basically, onCreate will initialize the provider, and then the query insert, update, and delete is basically handling that database operations. And you go through that through the content provider instead of directly accessing your database object for those. And then the get type, again, you may or may not need to implement that, but it will return the MIME type of your data for the provider. The last step is to register your provider in the manifest. So, you know, in your Android manifest, you have, you know, activities, service, and receivers, etc. And when you register, you will use a provider tag. And then you need to define the authority. As I said before, do you guys remember what the authority is? Content authority? What is a content authority? Out of all those terminologies that I mentioned earlier. So let's go back to here. So the authority identifies your content provider, right? So you need to define the authority, and then because it's unique, and then you give it the name. And then the exported false or true, that part is more related to the permission. This is the permission in general on your database. So when you write a content provider, by default, you do have access. Your app has access to your content provider. However, it's important to define whether Android column exported is false or true, because you want other apps to have access to your content provider or no, right? So if you don't want access, other apps to access your provider, you will set that to be false. There are also other permissions, which I'm not going to talk in details here. I think with the runtime permissions now also allow the granting the access on the specific record for the URI on the URI level. But here, this is more on the provider level. Okay, so I talked about writing your own content provider. Do you guys have any questions before I move on to talking about accessing? I went through pretty fast, and let's just take a very, very quick look at the code. My sample code here, again, I will go over pretty fast, but I think sometimes it's better to look at the code instead of the slides. Similar to my previous sample, the contract class will define your schema. Very similar. Okay. The only difference here, though, you will see all of that, your content authority, your path, and your base content URI, blah, blah, blah. These are the additional things because we're having content providers now, right, in the schema class. And you can go also look at the Android framework. I can show you earlier. Look at this context or browser or etc. See how they're doing that. And then we have a DB, extended DB helper. It's still the same, except in that I don't have all of my directing querying of the database anymore here. And I have a content provider class that I extended called the version provider. And in here we have a URI matcher and get type for the MIME type. And then basically we have all of these methods, query, insert, and update, and delete. And if you look inside of these, this is where you're actually working with the database over there, like over here, right? So your app is, your UI is no longer like directly accessing this. So that's the provider. And then I will talk about later on the accessing from the UI, how the UI will get the data. So that's writing the content provider. So any questions? Actually, let me just jump back. One thing I forgot to mention is registering in the manifest over here, the provider.
So, question about content provider. So, in Android, when you access photo or image, actually you are kind of using SQL backend.
Yes, this is why I said it's important to understand SQLite and content provider. Even if you don't write your own content provider, most likely you don't need to, but to understand what is a content provider, because everyone works with a content provider. I guarantee you, you guys all get your pictures and galleries and cameras and contacts, right? Okay. Okay, so let's move on and talk about accessing the content provider real quick. So to access a content provider, you need to request for permission if it's not your own. So the sample code I showed you is my own. I wrote a content provider. My database is simple. I'm managing Android versions, right? But what if you want to access contacts? You need to ask for permission to read the contacts or even write the contacts, right? In fact, I believe reading contacts might be in the dangerous permission group for the runtime permission. Like, you guys familiar with the new Marshmallow runtime permission? So yeah, it's a big deal asking for permission, right? So at a minimum, you will also need a content URI. So URI is basically like an address to locate your record, a projection. Now, do you guys remember what a projection is? I talked about it when I talked about the database at the very beginning. What is a projection?
The row, the columns?
Yeah, so it's like the columns, but not the columns you define in your schema. It's what you want in your query result. So that's what a projection is. And then you will need a ContentResolver or a CursorLoader. I will talk about what it is. And then you will need a cursor, and you will do something with the data you retrieved. So that's how to access a content. To access with the ContentResolver, ContentResolver has been available since API 1. And again, I should have provided an example here. You will see in my sample code is basically you need to define all the URI, projection, selection, blah, 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 etc. How you query it and what you get back, right? But you can also access the content with the CursorLoader. The CursorLoader was available since API 11. And CursorLoader is a better way for accessing the data, especially you expect the Let's say if you were just getting one record, maybe it's okay you use the ContentResolver. But the CursorLoader with the operation, complex query, etc., it's better to use the CursorLoader. So what is a CursorLoader? It targets a content provider, and it will load data asynchronously. And it handles the cursor lifecycle. For example, it will automatically rerun the query when data associated with the query changes. So, if you look at my sample code later on when you get home, you will notice that in my sample code of the sample database where I didn't exactly handle the threading, I accessed the database from the main thread, which is you're not supposed to. And on top of that, when I have actually maybe it's a different one, like if I add a record, I totally delete the whole, the adapter thing and reload. It's just like a very dumb way of doing it. But with the cursor loader actually will do your requerying and also show the data in the UI automatically for you. So I want to talk about a little bit about the Android system content providers and just mention it in here. If you actually, before I jump to that one, I just want to show you real quick of the cursor loader real quick. In my app, I have just the one screen and with the main fragment, and you will actually see the cursor loader here. You implement the loader manager loader callback, and then there's a couple of methods that you have to override. And then here you need to create the loader, and then the finish. There's a couple of them over here. But these are also help you manage automatically requerying and showing the data to the UI. Okay, so I will jump back to the system provider part. If you click on this link that I provided, you will see all of the data that you can access that's provided to you by Android. Okay, there's like photos, contacts, etc. So all of that. And then in the where I was showing you earlier, when I was searching for anything called a contract, these are also, actually, let me just not search for that. So in the provider folder, so all of those things that I searched is actually in the provider folder. But if you go to the source code, look at the provider folder, you will see all of these classes. The schema and the provider, schema and provider, that comes from the Android SDK. So that is helpful, especially if you, some people who work with context contract, which is quite complicated. Sometimes you might need to go dig into the code to figure out how to actually join the queries to get the data out. Okay. So just some simple examples. Again, the general form of the URI is you have the authority. You have to say content column / your authority, and then the path and the ID. Here are the examples. If you were to access contacts or access media, you asked earlier about pictures, so that's media, or a calendar, right? And then here are just the examples of the full path, the full URI with everything, the authority, the path, and the exact ID. Okay, so these are just examples of accessing from a media store using either ContentResolver or a CursorLoader for getting image. So you'll use this. Okay, so I want to move on, talk about some libraries and resources because I went through very, very fast. And SQLite and Content Provider are actually pretty complicated. You really have to look at the sample code and try it out yourself, because at University of Washington, when I teach the subject, it's a 3-hour class, and even with that, I will reiterate in the subsequent classes. So I went through very, very fast because of the time. Do you have any quick questions before I move on? No? Okay. So there are lots of boilerplate code and very tedious to work with, but at least I hope I give you a high-level overview of at least under the hood how it works, right? What are the classes, and you can go look and troubleshoot. And here are some of the libraries that can help you without having to dealing with the exact writing the schema and the tables and the columns and the projections and the cursor, etc. The first one, library, SQLite Asset Helper. This one, not so much of cutting boilerplate code, but it serves a different purpose. I have the sample code here. Just quickly show you. Notice here, I don't have a schema class. I don't have that blah, blah, blah contract class or open helper class, right? All I have is this version database thing. I call it database, but it's really extending the SQLite Asset Helper. SQLite Asset Helper open source library actually extends that SQLite DB open helper. And it's kind of similar. In here, after I extend it here, I give it a database name, and it must match a physical database here. You see, I have this database where I can enter a whole bunch of data. I can create 40 or whatever, a lot of records, because that if you have a pre-made database that's shipping with your app, you don't want to write those SQL statement like a million times, right? So you can just put the data there, and then you create this folder called the databases under your assets folder. You put it there, and then you define there. It will automatically create for you. And then for my UI, I just, because in here I have a cursor return in my UI, I just directly use it. Now this one, you still need to handle your threading. The threading or requerying is not handled. But the purpose of this library is more for you to, instead of writing all that statements, you prepared your data ahead of time and put it under the assets folder. And this library will help you create the data. It will create a database which is no longer under that assets folder. It will be under the folder I showed you earlier, under your package name on the internal storage. Okay, nice thing about that one is if you want to work with Content Provider, you can, because that extends the DB open helper, right? The SQLite DB open helper. So it works nicely with Content Provider. Another library is called the SQLite by Square. Remember earlier, some of the challenges I mentioned about working with SQLite Database. What are some of the challenges?
Syncing the data from
Syncing, what else?
totally fine.
Oh.
When data change, like
Yes, so that not only you perform the database operations asynchronously, as well as the requerying of the data and the refreshing in your UI, right? For the whole talk that I talked about, the approach I took is writing a content provider on top of it and using a CursorLoader. Now, I did not go into exact details of a CursorLoader, but you get the gist of it. The CursorLoader will handle that. Now, with the SQLite by Square, it works with RxJava and RxAndroid, and it will do all that requery, notify when data changes. So which one of you actually heard of RxJava, RxAndroid, or actually work with it? Okay, yeah, so if you actually do, your code base uses that, this is a nice library to use. And then another library is called Cupboard, and this one, I haven't used it myself, but I just read some articles and watched the Android dialogue by Chiki with Hugo, and I know that the advantage is you don't have to go write your schema and projection and cursor, etc. It will help you, to be less tedious, and also easy filtering of query. Some mapping to objects, filtering of query, but it's not like heavy duty joining the queries, complex joining. It works with both SQLite and Content Provider. And as I recall watching that Android dialogue, I remember he said that it works with Content Provider, for example, if you want to get some data out of one of those contacts or images that I mentioned earlier, right? Another option is to use object to relational mapping ORM. And two of the libraries, one is GreenDAO and then another one is ORMLite. I used the first one, GreenDAO, briefly. That first one, they map to Pojos, to your objects, so it's very important for you to maintain that relationship, and this is a good alternative. So the GreenDAO relies on generating a bunch of the classes for you, for maintaining the database and schema, etc. And then the ORMLite is using annotation for that mapping. So these are just a couple of libraries, and by all means, there are a whole lot more libraries to work with SQLite and Content Provider. That goes to show how complex this subject is and how painful this subject is, right? So let's take a quick look. While I was doing research preparing for my talk, I found this nice post by this person for AnDevCon news and 10 of these different libraries, and he even mentioned something RX cupboard, which use RX Java with the cupboard library I mentioned, but one step further using RX Java. So those are the 10 libraries. You can check it out. And then if you're on the Android Arsenal, if you search for the keyword SQLite or Content Provider, you will see all of these, different libraries that you can work with, mostly free. Some might be paid, but you can go do your homework, because depending on your situation or your app, some libraries might work better than others. Then classes and tutorials. I found this tutorial when I started out learning SQLite and Content Provider. His tutorial helped me greatly. He did a good job of explaining it. And then the Udacity class of developing Android apps, this one goes to in detail, in depth. It's a 10-week class, but a couple of sessions actually talked about SQLite Database and Content Provider, JUnit tests, etc. So it's very nice if you want to go into details. Now, if you don't have time to go into all that, drill into details, you just want to look at sample code, you can look at my sample code that I have put over here that I showed you earlier, just a couple of them. And then another good sample code is the Google I/O sample code that you can see how they created the schema, the DB helper class, as well as the Content Provider, CursorLoader, all that in this sample code. Great, so that's the end of my talk. And do you guys have any questions? Yes?
Is there any, for the ORM library, is there any ORM library that supports Content Provider?
Oh, I don't know that off the top of my head. My guess is not, but you can check. Yeah. At least the two I listed, I don't think they work with content providers, but I could be wrong. Any other questions? No? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Please fill out the class feedback. You can fill it out in the physical form or on your Android app or on the web app. If you need to contact me, you can follow me on Twitter or connect with me on Google+. Thanks, everyone.